The sun was setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across the quiet town. It was a peaceful evening, the kind where everything seemed to move at its own slow pace. People were finishing up their work, getting ready to relax, and the hum of everyday life filled the air. But for Sheriff John Harper, this evening would be anything but ordinary. The sounds of a quiet town suddenly felt out of place as he stood in the parking lot, watching his car, the car that had been with him through thick and thin, go up in flames. The acrid smell of burning rubber and leather filled his nostrils as his heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't move. His legs felt like they had turned to stone. His eyes were locked on the inferno, but his mind was racing. Why? Why was this happening? Who would do something so reckless, so violent, in broad daylight? John's mind reeled. He had been a sheriff for 15 years. In this small, tight-knit town, everyone knew everyone, and the respect for law enforcement ran deep. He had worked tirelessly to keep peace, to maintain a sense of justice and order. He had been the figure people turned to when they needed help. But now, as he watched his life's work, the car that symbolized his role in this community, burning before him, he felt a wave of betrayal so strong it almost knocked the air from his lungs. The flames licked the night sky, crackling and popping, as if mocking him, daring him to make a move. Then, a realization hit him. The officers standing nearby, two of his own, Mark Daniels and Sarah Quinn, were laughing. The sound was low at first, almost an uncomfortable chuckle, but then it grew. Mark, the younger officer who had always been too eager, and Sarah, who had once been a promising recruit with a passion for justice, both seemed oddly at ease, as if this was nothing more than an everyday occurrence. John's hands clenched into fists. The air around him thickened with confusion and anger, his heart thundering in his chest. It couldn't be them. They wouldn't. But as the wind carried the smoke toward him, he saw it clearly. Mark was holding a lighter in his hand, and Sarah had the fire extinguisher at her side, her expression blank, unreadable. John could barely breathe, let alone process what was happening. His car wasn't just a means of transportation, it was a symbol. It had been with him through countless calls, late-night chases, and quiet mornings when the world was still asleep. To see it burning was like watching his identity being torn apart in front of him. His badge, his years of service, his community, they all seemed so distant now, as if they were fading into the smoke. For a moment, everything stood still. The laughter of the officers, the crackling of the fire, the pounding of his heart, everything faded into the background. His mind flashed back to his first day as sheriff, standing on this very parking lot, full of hope and determination. He had been so sure of himself, of the work he was doing. But now, as the flames grew higher, he felt something else, something he had never experienced in all his years of service, fear. Fear that the people he had trusted the most, the ones he had trained, mentored, and fought alongside, could turn against him. This wasn't just a stolen moment of anger or a rebellious act. This was personal. John's voice caught in his throat as he forced himself to speak. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his voice steady but laced with disbelief. Mark and Sarah stopped laughing. Their eyes flickered toward him, but neither of them said a word. The fire roared louder in response, almost mocking him, as if the flames themselves were daring him to challenge what was happening. Mark finally broke the silence, his voice low and cold. "It's just a car, Sheriff. You're making a big deal out of nothing." Sarah didn't speak. She stood still, her eyes avoiding his, her posture rigid. She looked uncomfortable, but not guilty. There was no remorse in her expression, only indifference. John took a step forward, his mind racing. He was the sheriff. He was supposed to be the one in control, the one people could trust. But now, here he was, standing in front of his burning car, at the mercy of his own officers. His thoughts collided. Could they really be behind this? Had the pressure of the job, the long hours, the endless cases, finally worn them down so much that they'd resort to something like this? Or was there something more, something deeper, going on here? Was this an isolated incident, or the beginning of something much worse? He felt his anger growing, mixing with confusion and hurt. He had trusted these officers. Mark had come to him for advice, Sarah had been his most promising recruit. Yet here they were, standing by while his life's work went up in smoke. The flames were getting higher, dancing like hungry monsters licking the sky, and John was left standing there, helpless. "You have no idea what you've done," he muttered under his breath, but Mark heard him. He smirked, clearly unconcerned. "We did what we had to do," he replied, his voice dripping with an eerie calm. The town, John thought. This town had always been a place where people helped each other, where justice wasn't just a job, it was a way of life. And now, in front of him, his own officers had just destroyed the trust that had been built over decades. In that moment, he knew that whatever happened next would change everything. There was no going back. And yet, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of clarity, he couldn't be afraid anymore. This was his moment to make a choice. Would he fight back? Would he confront these officers and risk everything? Or would he simply walk away, knowing that his entire career, and the integrity of the department he had built, hung in the balance? As he stood there, watching the fire consume everything he had worked for, one question burned into his mind: why did they do it? The days that followed the incident at the parking lot felt like a blur to Sheriff John Harper. He had always prided himself on being level-headed, even in the most challenging situations. But nothing had prepared him for this. The trust he had built over years, the foundation of respect between him and his officers, seemed to shatter in an instant. The quiet town, once a sanctuary of safety and routine, now felt unfamiliar, as though the air had changed. Whispers of the burning car spread quickly, like wildfire, through every corner of the town. People who had once greeted him with smiles now avoided his gaze, unsure of what to make of the situation. Some speculated that the sheriff had been the victim of an unfortunate act of vandalism, while others wondered if it was an inside job. But no one knew the full story. Not yet. John knew he had to address it. He couldn't let the town stew in uncertainty. He was the sheriff, and his duty was clear. But how could he do that when the officers involved were the ones he had personally trained? These weren't just his colleagues, they were the people he had trusted with his life in moments of danger. Mark Daniels had been like a son to him, a young officer with boundless energy and ambition. Sarah Quinn, though more reserved, had always shown great promise. He had seen potential in both of them, potential to rise to the highest ranks of law enforcement. But now, they had turned on him in the most brutal way possible. It was hard for John to understand how it had come to this. The hours had been long, the calls relentless, and the pressure on everyone had been mounting. He had seen it in their eyes, the exhaustion, the frustration, the quiet rebellion simmering beneath their calm exteriors. But even with all of that, he never imagined they would do something like this. It wasn't just a car. It was a symbol. It was the vehicle that had taken him to the scenes of countless crimes, that had carried him through the worst of his career, that had represented his role in this community. By burning it, they weren't just destroying property, they were stripping away everything he had worked for. This town trusts me, and I trust you. And right now, that trust is broken. The room was silent for a long moment. John let their words sink in, trying to understand their perspective, trying to piece together how things had unraveled so quickly. It was clear now that the tension between them had been building for a long time, but it had all exploded in that moment of recklessness. The pressure, the exhaustion, the feeling of being unheard, it had all contributed to this disastrous choice. But even so, John couldn't excuse what they had done. The burning of his car wasn't just a cry for help, it was an act of defiance, a line crossed that couldn't be easily undone. Mark seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. "Sheriff, we didn't think it through. We were angry. But we can fix this. We can make it right. His voice had lost some of its earlier defiance, replaced now with an undercurrent of fear. John stood up, his gaze shifting between the two officers. He wasn't sure if he could ever trust them the same way again, but he knew one thing for certain: something had to change. This wasn't just about him and his car. This was about the future of the department, and more importantly, about what kind of law enforcement they wanted to be. He was the sheriff. It was time for him to make a choice. "I'll think about it," he said quietly. "But right now, I need both of you to understand one thing: this isn't something we just move past. It's something we have to fix. Together. Or not at all." As they left his office, John sat back in his chair, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The next steps were unclear, but he knew that his role as sheriff had just become more complicated than it had ever been. The trust between him and his officers had been broken, and rebuilding it would take more than just words. But one thing was for certain: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next few days felt like a slow, painful unraveling for Sheriff John Harper. The confrontation with Mark and Sarah had been a turning point, but it was far from over. He spent sleepless nights wrestling with the weight of the decisions that lay ahead. The fire had burned more than just his car; it had ignited a much deeper problem within the department, one that no amount of time or apologies could easily put out. The tension between him and his officers was palpable, and despite his best efforts to appear calm, John felt the fissures in the fabric of his leadership deepening with each passing day. It wasn't just about the betrayal anymore, it was about a system that had started to crack under the pressure of time and unspoken frustrations. The entire town was watching, waiting to see how he would respond. He knew that if he didn't act decisively, it wouldn't just be the department that would fracture, it would be the trust the town had placed in him. John had spent years building that trust, slowly earning the respect of both his officers and the community. But now, everything seemed uncertain. The calls kept coming in, the case files piling up, but his mind couldn't focus on anything but the damage done. Mark and Sarah had made a choice, and while they had expressed regret, John knew it wasn't as simple as a mistake that could be swept under the rug. Trust, once broken, was never easily repaired. There was no manual for handling this kind of betrayal. He was in uncharted territory, forced to confront the truth about the cracks in the department he had failed to see. Days turned into weeks, and John found himself pacing through the halls of the station late at night. The others had left for the day, and the quiet was suffocating. He could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights above him, the sound of his boots echoing on the linoleum floor. In the back of his mind, he kept replaying the events, trying to make sense of it all. But it was a puzzle that didn't fit together neatly, no matter how much he rearranged the pieces. His officers, Mark and Sarah in particular, had been burned out. He could see that now. The long shifts, the unrelenting pressure, the endless cases, it had taken its toll on them. But that didn't justify what had happened. No matter the reasons, the act itself had been unforgivable. John had always believed in second chances, in the possibility of redemption. But this was different. This was about the integrity of the entire department. If he allowed this to slide, if he let them off the hook with a simple slap on the wrist, he would be sending the message that there were no consequences for betrayal. He would be failing not just as a sheriff, but as the leader this town needed him to be. He needed to make an example of this situation, to show that there were lines that couldn't be crossed, no matter the circumstances. But there was another part of him that still wanted to find a way to bring Mark and Sarah back, to repair the damage and restore the team. That conflict gnawed at him, kept him up at night, and it wasn't getting any easier. Then, one morning, as he stood in his office, a knock at the door broke his thoughts. He didn't have to look up to know who it was. It was Mark, standing there with his shoulders slumped, eyes downcast, as if he was carrying the weight of the world on his back. Behind him, Sarah stood silently, her gaze focused on the floor. She hadn't spoken much since their last meeting, and John wasn't sure if she even knew what to say anymore. Mark stepped forward, and for the first time in weeks, there was no defiance in his voice. "Sheriff, we need to talk," he said, his tone softer than usual. John gestured for them to sit, his hands clasped in front of him. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this conversation, but he knew it was inevitable. Mark's eyes met his briefly before he spoke again, his voice tinged with something that was almost guilt, almost regret. "We know what we did was wrong. And we've had time to think about it. Time to really understand the damage we've caused. To you, to the department, to this town. We've been under a lot of pressure, Sheriff. We've been burned out, and we didn't know how to handle it. But that's no excuse for what happened. We were wrong." Sarah finally spoke up, her voice low but firm. "We let our frustration take control, and it was selfish. We made a bad decision, and we know it's going to take more than just words to make it right. But we're asking for a chance, Sheriff. A chance to prove that we can do better. We don't want to lose everything over one moment of foolishness." John listened, his gaze steady, trying to weigh their words. They were asking for redemption, for a second chance, but John knew better than anyone that trust was not easily given. It took years to build, but only a second to shatter. Still, a part of him couldn't ignore the sincerity in their voices. He had seen both of them at their best, Mark with his enthusiasm and quick thinking, Sarah with her quiet determination and strength. He had believed in them, and maybe there was still a chance to rebuild that trust. But how could he? How could he ever trust them again after what they had done? The weeks that followed were a crucible for Sheriff John Harper, a test of his resolve and leadership in ways he hadn't expected. The tension between him, Mark, and Sarah didn't dissolve overnight, despite their best efforts. In fact, it was like a shadow that loomed over every interaction, an unspoken understanding that things could never return to how they had been. John had given them a chance, but that chance was not one of forgiveness, it was one of redemption, and it would require more than just time. It required action. Mark and Sarah had to prove they could rebuild the trust they had shattered, not just in the sheriff's office, but within the entire community they had sworn to protect. The town, too, was watching closely. Word had spread fast, too fast. As with any small town, rumors and gossip moved like wildfire. People who once had supported the sheriff's office were now divided. Some believed in second chances, others were more cynical, wondering whether the sheriff was too soft, too willing to overlook the betrayal of his own officers. For every person who offered words of support, there was another who questioned John's judgment. It was a tough position to be in. As the days went on, John had to remind himself that it wasn't just about the loyalty of his officers or the opinions of the townsfolk, it was about doing what was right. And right now, that meant standing by his decision to give Mark and Sarah a chance to make things right, no matter how difficult it might become. At the same time, John couldn't ignore the ripple effects that the fire had caused. The fire wasn't just about a burning car, it was a symbol, a turning point in the way things had been done, a clear signal that something deeper was wrong. The long hours, the stress, the feeling of being pushed to their limits, it was all starting to show. He began to realize that Mark and Sarah were not the only ones suffering from the weight of their jobs. It wasn't just an isolated incident. The department as a whole was under strain, and if something didn't change soon, this would happen again. But how could he address a problem so complex? How could he fix something that seemed so deeply ingrained? John started to implement small changes, ones that he hoped would not only rebuild his department but also restore the community's faith in him as their sheriff. He held one-on-one meetings with each officer, listening to their concerns in a way he never had before. The more he listened, the more he understood. Officers were dealing with the stress of the job in different ways. Some, like Mark and Sarah, had resorted to acts of rebellion, unable to cope with their frustrations. Others had become withdrawn, retreating into themselves. The weight of their work was heavy on their shoulders, and no one had been there to help lighten the load. It wasn't long before their suspicions proved correct. One of the employees at a local security company, someone who had been with the company for years, was found to be involved. The man had been feeding information to a ring of burglars, tipping them off about which houses were most vulnerable. It was a devastating revelation, one that shook the town to its core. The man had been trusted, part of the fabric of the community, and yet he had betrayed that trust for personal gain. The arrest was swift, but the aftermath was still difficult. John couldn't help but feel a sense of relief, but it was mixed with sadness. The investigation had been a success, but it came at a cost. Mark and Sarah had proved themselves in the field, but there was still a long road ahead of them. They had helped solve the case, but their journey toward redemption wasn't over. They had taken the first step, but the scars of the past would remain, and the question lingered, could the department ever fully recover? Could John, as sheriff, ever fully trust his officers again? The future was uncertain, and while there had been a victory, the real work was just beginning. John had to rebuild not just his department, but the faith that had been lost. And in that moment, he knew that he couldn't do it alone. The road to redemption would require all of them, Mark, Sarah, and every officer on the force, to take responsibility for their actions and work together to heal the wounds they had created. Only then could the town truly heal. As the weeks turned into months, the ripple effects of the burglaries began to fade, but the consequences of the events surrounding Mark, Sarah, and the department's struggle were still fresh. The town had seen how the sheriff's office handled the crisis, and though the case had been closed, there was still an unsettled feeling lingering in the air. People were divided, unsure of what the future would hold for their law enforcement officers. John knew that rebuilding the department's reputation would take more than just solving one case. It would require sustained effort and a long-term commitment to restore both the community's trust and the unity of his officers. As much as John had wanted to believe that the worst was behind them, the truth was that the battle to rebuild the department was only just beginning. John threw himself into his work, pouring hours into making the sheriff's office a place of collaboration and healing. He met with the town's council to discuss ways to improve the community-police relationship, emphasizing transparency and open communication. It was clear to him that people wanted to see that the department was not just a group of officers in uniform, but a part of the community, a group of individuals who genuinely cared about the people they swore to protect. John's commitment to this idea led to town meetings where local residents could voice their concerns, ask questions, and provide feedback. Slowly but surely, the walls of distrust began to come down, and the town started to see that John and his department were working to rebuild their bond with the community. Mark and Sarah, meanwhile, were struggling to find their place. They had both been working overtime, trying to prove themselves to their fellow officers, but even their best efforts couldn't change the reality of their past mistakes. It was an uphill battle, one that was exhausting on both an emotional and physical level. Despite their sincere attempts at redemption, not everyone was willing to let go of the past. Some officers had forgiven them, but others were still holding grudges. There were whispers in the break room, cold shoulders in the hallways, and a sense of division that John couldn't ignore. The department wasn't healing as quickly as he had hoped, and it seemed as though the rift was deeper than he had realized. But then came the call that changed everything. It was a quiet evening, and John was at home, reviewing case files when his phone rang. He knew immediately it wasn't good news. The voice on the other end was frantic. There had been an accident. A multi-car pileup on the highway just outside of town. The wreckage was severe, and multiple people were trapped inside their cars. Emergency responders were on their way, but John knew it wasn't going to be enough. He needed to act quickly. He gathered his team and headed to the scene, but what he didn't expect was the sight that greeted him. The highway was in chaos, cars crumpled and overturned, the road slick with oil and debris. It was the kind of scene that John had witnessed countless times in his career, but there was something different about this one. There was a sense of urgency in the air, a desperation that had taken hold of everyone present. John's team quickly began assessing the situation, but it was clear that the worst of the wreckage was beyond their immediate reach. A few of the victims were trapped beneath the wreckage of a semi-truck, and time was running out. That's when Mark and Sarah, who had been part of the backup team, made a decision that no one expected. Without hesitation, they darted toward the wreckage, working together to pry open a door that had been wedged between two mangled vehicles. The scene was chaotic, and every second mattered. As John watched them, something clicked in his mind. The trust they had been working so hard to regain had been fully restored, not by words or promises, but by their actions. There, in the middle of the disaster, Mark and Sarah showed their true character. They didn't hesitate. They didn't worry about how their colleagues would view them. They didn't care about the judgment they had endured in the past months. They cared only about saving lives. Working tirelessly through the night, Mark, Sarah, and the rest of the team managed to extract the victims, some of whom were barely conscious but alive. It was a harrowing experience, one that left everyone involved physically drained, but emotionally lifted. As the scene began to clear, and the injured were transported to the hospital, John stood with his officers, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. This wasn't just a victory for the sheriff's office, it was a victory for the entire town. In that moment, the lines between past mistakes and present actions blurred. Mark and Sarah had proven themselves in a way that words never could. As the days went by, the atmosphere at the sheriff's office began to shift. John noticed a change, not just in Mark and Sarah but in the entire department. There was a renewed sense of camaraderie, a shared understanding that they were all in this together. They had been through something transformative, something that had tested them all, officers and sheriff alike. The accident had become a turning point, not just in the department's recovery, but in how they saw each other. They had fought together, worked together, and proven that they could still be the team they once were, despite the challenges they faced. The community, too, began to notice the shift. When the townspeople saw the dedication and heroism displayed by their sheriff and his officers, it began to heal old wounds. The whispers of doubt faded, replaced by genuine respect. John had proved that he could lead with integrity, even in the face of betrayal. And Mark and Sarah, having risked everything to save others, had shown that their redemption was not just a hopeful wish, it was a reality that they had earned. The scars of the past were still there, but they no longer defined the department. They were a part of the story, yes, but not the whole story. As the department worked to rebuild, John reflected on the road they had traveled. There had been pain, regret, and difficult decisions along the way, but there had also been growth, redemption, and the unwavering commitment to what truly mattered. The sheriff's office was not perfect, but it was stronger than it had been before. John had learned that leadership wasn't just about making the right calls in the moment, it was about guiding people through the hardest times, allowing them the space to fall and rise again. And as he stood in front of his team, watching them work with newfound unity, John knew that they had overcome something much bigger than a single fire or betrayal. They had overcome themselves. As the town moved forward, the sheriff's office emerged stronger, with a renewed sense of purpose. For John, Mark, Sarah, and the rest of the officers, the lesson was clear: redemption wasn't a destination, it was a journey, one that required every ounce of effort and commitment. They had made it through the storm, and now, together, they would face whatever came next. As the sheriff's department continued to rebuild, the weight of the past slowly began to fade, though its lessons remained etched in the minds of those who had lived through it. For John Harper, the journey was never truly over. He had learned that trust wasn't just something you gave, it was something you earned every day, through actions and decisions, not just promises. The department was moving forward, but the road was still long, and they had to continue proving that they were capable of carrying out the responsibility placed on their shoulders. It wasn't just about doing the job, it was about doing it with honor and integrity, even when no one was watching. Mark and Sarah, now fully integrated back into the team, found themselves walking a tightrope. The respect they had earned during the rescue was undeniable, but both of them knew they still had to work harder than ever to maintain it. It wasn't about proving they were capable, they had already done that. It was about proving they had changed. Each day, they pushed themselves, striving to be the officers they had once been, but with the wisdom that only comes from experiencing failure and redemption. They learned to hold themselves accountable, to never take the badge for granted, and to remember the people they were meant to serve. The town itself was beginning to heal in ways that none of them had expected. After the burglary ring had been busted, and the car fire was long forgotten, there was a shift in the air, something unspoken, yet palpable. The sheriff's department wasn't just an institution, it was becoming part of the town's identity once more. People began to show more respect, not out of fear or obligation, but out of genuine appreciation for the officers who risked their lives each day. They weren't just figures in uniforms, they were individuals with families, with struggles, with hopes. John could see it now, clearer than ever before. The town needed the sheriff's department, and the department needed the town. They were inseparable. Despite the progress, however, John couldn't ignore the underlying issue that still haunted him. The town was healing, but there were still pockets of division, places where the tension between those who had forgiven the officers and those who hadn't was still palpable. It was like a crack in a beautiful piece of pottery, the pieces might fit back together, but you could still see the fracture. The work John had put into restoring his department was paying off, but it was a slow burn, one that required constant maintenance. There were no shortcuts when it came to trust. One particular moment stood out as a reflection of how far they had come, but also how far they still had to go. One afternoon, during a routine traffic stop, a driver, a local businessman, had been uncooperative, borderline confrontational, when one of the officers, new to the department, handled the situation poorly. The officer had let his emotions get the best of him, raising his voice when the situation didn't call for it. Mark and Sarah were the first to respond, stepping in quickly to de-escalate the situation. John watched from a distance as they calmly and professionally handled the driver, diffusing the tension without escalating the confrontation. It was a small moment, but it spoke volumes about how far they had come. Mark and Sarah didn't just do their jobs, they did them with empathy, with understanding. They weren't perfect, and neither was the department, but they were trying. The town had witnessed their journey firsthand, and in that brief moment, they could see that it wasn't about perfection, it was about progress. As the year drew to a close, the sheriff's department began planning for the future. John knew that, while the past had shaped them, it wasn't the defining factor. The department could no longer be defined by the fire or the betrayals or the mistakes. It had to be defined by what they had learned and what they would do next. They had to become a symbol of redemption, not just for themselves but for the community that had placed its trust in them. One of the most important steps in this process was the decision to hold community outreach programs. John began organizing local events, inviting citizens to interact with their officers in a more personal, informal setting. The sheriff's office hosted barbecues, town halls, and even volunteered in local schools, showing the town that they were more than just the people behind the badges. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments when people reminded them of the past, when eyes lingered a little too long or words were said with hidden weight. But John pushed forward, knowing that the healing process would take time. It wasn't about erasing the past, it was about building something better from it. Through it all, John couldn't help but reflect on what this journey had taught him. The sheriff's office wasn't just a job, it was a calling. A calling that required more than just leadership, it required vulnerability, honesty, and a willingness to admit when you had failed. In many ways, he had failed his officers, his community, and even himself. But in those failures, there had been growth. There had been change. The journey of rebuilding had not been without its scars, but those scars told a story of resilience, redemption, and the enduring power of second chances. For Mark and Sarah, the past year had been transformative. They had faced their darkest moments and come out stronger. They had made mistakes, but they had learned, and they had worked hard to prove themselves worthy of their badge once again. The community had watched them grow, and they had earned the respect they had lost. But more than that, they had become more than just officers. They had become symbols of hope for those who had ever doubted their own ability to change. They had shown that redemption was possible, even for those who had fallen the hardest. The sheriff's department had come a long way from the chaos of the fire and the betrayal. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever truly is, but it had been rebuilt. Stronger. Better. United. And as John stood in front of his officers, now more confident than ever, he knew they had all earned something precious, the trust of their community. They had faced their demons and emerged on the other side, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The road had been long, but they had traveled it together, and that was what mattered most. In the end, they weren't just a department, they were a family, one that had been forged in the fire of adversity and tempered with the strength of redemption.